Well, the New York Times is facing a massive union walkout today. About 1,100 union staffers were supposed to have halted all work by midnight for a whole 24 hours and are said to start picketing outside the New York Times offices at 1 p.m.
Union staffers are striking for better wages and remote work policies, and though they've been going back and forth with the New York NewsGuild, they have not reached an agreement, missing the December 8th deadline. The strike, which is the biggest protest of its kind at the paper in 40 years, is intended to show how important its reporting is. Staffers are calling on readers to join them by avoiding visiting the paper on all its platforms and to turning to local news instead.
We reached out to the New York Times for comment on the walkout, and in a statement to Rising, the spokesperson said they are ready to resume negotiations and that it's disappointing that such extreme action is being taken when they're not at an impasse. They went on to say, quote, the NewsGuild's proposal, which would add more than $100 million in additional costs over the life of the contract, would make it difficult to sustain our investment in journalism. We're committed to continuing to serve our readers and are prepared to do so without disruption.
Well, it's worth noting in that statement, they point to the cost of meeting the demands of these writers. And this is reporting from the Washington Post. Had to go in and make sure I could find some coverage of this outside of the New York Times. They point out that although there is a very challenging media environment right now, I think everyone is well aware of that, executives at the New York Times said in their latest earnings call that they had grown the newsroom and projected a total adjusted operating profit of between $320 million and $330 million by the end of the year. Some staffers argue that they should share more of the fruits of this recent success after enduring stagnant wages and belt tightening during leaner times for the company. Quote, that's where it feels more than just a matter of disagreement on numbers, but really a slap in the face, said film critic A.O. Scott. We have devoted so much of our time, energy, work, and love to this paper, which seems unwilling to recognize or reward that contribution. It's interesting. Obviously, we are in a media community ourselves. I've seen an enormous amount of support from kind of the left media community that I am in, despite having a lot of substantive disagreements with the way the coverage goes down over at the New York Times. I think a lot of those are perceived to be, sort of management decisions, and there are a lot of individual good people who work over there. And it is frustrating to see in this context, as in so many others, that when profits are sky high, the profit share never seems to trickle down to the people whose work enabled those profits in the very first place.
Look, the New York Times is an outlier in the media environment. They've done very well for themselves in this environment of chaos where so many newsrooms, media organizations having to pivot, having to lay off people. They've just figured it out, and they're killing it, frankly. Yeah. That said, I think my substantive disagreements with the New York Times often is disagreements with reporters and staff members. With a kind of woke tyranny that has been weaponized against other employees of the New York Times on many occasions, including editors that were let go over the decision to publish the Tom Cotton op-ed, that excellent coronavirus reporter we've had on to discuss monkeypox, who was run out by fellow employees, not liking his strident tone or things he said on a field trip. Was he fired,
or did he leave?
He was pressed out by the employees wanting him gone. Yeah, he was fired. I think he was fired.
I'm not. If he's fired, he was fired. It's just that it is true that in a lot of these instances, people quit their jobs and then accuse the organization of having fired them when that wasn't exactly the case. They just felt social pressure to conform.
Okay, but the idea of the workplace environment being hostile or impossible to continue is a progressive concept. So.
Right, but that's a different thing. Like, for example, with the Tom Cotton. There were people who disagreed with that op-ed. There were also people at the institution who chose to run the op-ed and defended it to the end of days. So, it's
the op-ed editor was fired.
Yeah, that person was fired. But I don't know. Like I disagree with a lot of these kind of decisions and with a lot of the individuals who work at these kinds of institutions as well. But I don't know. I'm frustrated by the perception, as a leftist who is very much blocked out of these spaces as well, I'm frustrated by the perception that there's a kind of a left-leaning political bent here. And I know that's not what you're saying exactly. They're talking about more specifically in the culture wars, because it does seem to me to be more like an establishment gatekeeping, and that many of those decisions, those editorial decisions, are being made by people who aren't, for example, the labor reporters that we interview.
So the person I referred to, Don McNeil, he was not fired. He did resign, but he was punished for what went down, and so then he felt he had to resign.
How was he punished?
I mean, I have to go.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to
greater into the details.
to quiz you on this. The point of the matter is that I think that no one can dispute the value of having major media institutions that have the resources to do deep investigations, the likes of which local media and smaller organizations unfortunately just don't have, because we have had this kind of corporatization of the media sphere where a lot of the local news outlets have had to shut down, and the only people who can really fly reporters out to localities and do the deep dives and the longer term reporting that are so necessary to keep the public informed are places like the New York Times. So we're in a little bit of a vice grip here, where we're now forced to rely on them, and we absolutely, want the people who work there to be paid for the.
There was some reporting in Semaphore, the new publication, actually started by Ben Smith, the former New York Times media columnist, who was fantastic at the job. Before that, he was head of BuzzFeed.
Yeah.
He was great columnist for the New York Times. He left to start this new publication, Semaphore, and there was some reporting from him on the workplace climate at the New York Times beginning to resemble a kind of elite college campus, with bringing in inclusivity administrators who will have more and more say in what things are like. All of those things having led to, on college campuses, in my view, and other places, a kind of very ideologically conformist environment, an environment that's not productive for collegial interactions or for free thinking or for all of those things. That's the kind of stuff that makes someone like me worry about what would happen in the New York Times, and I don't know what role the union. In one version, a union could actually provide pushback from that, protecting employees who are getting in trouble with these kinds of people. But it doesn't quite seem to work out that way in some of the, or at least in the campus settings, because it's often other students, other young people, many of the times getting mad about it, and then the administrators cave because they're mad. I don't know. There are very interesting dynamics here. That then the labor element comes in. And,
look, I want to say firmly, first and foremost, people are doing work. They should be compensated for their work, regardless of if I like them, or regardless if I particularly, appreciate the
very
video.
Well compensated, though. That's true.
They're not. They're not. And the point of the matter is the executives are being extremely well compensated because they have running a very profitable industry, and we have to make a decision about whether or not, For some reason, the idea of a wealth tax is anathema to me. We shouldn't put a cap on how much someone could earn. But working people actually working and creating profits for a business, we think, well, if there's extra profits, they should be happy with what they're getting, and only the people at the top should have any access to that profit share. I think that's ridiculous. So it doesn't matter how much anybody makes. If they're earning profit and the business is getting increasingly profitable and there are these windfalls at the top, they want a bigger piece of that pie. And that's if the execs don't want to pay them, fine. They're going to have to figure out how to staff a whole new newsroom. This is what it means for labor to exercise their power. They're calling their bluff, and we'll see what happens. If they're really not worth all of that, they don't have to pay them, and the New York Times can go and find a bunch of scabs to break the strike and people to replace these people like A.O. Scott and these big names that a lot of folks have come to rely on and trust and to have a real affinity for. That's the game.
But some of those people, the people who big names, whose names those are people being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is all good for them. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. But that's
taking these outlier cases and acting like the vast majority of people, of the 1,100 people who are walking out, these beat reporters, people who are editors and other kinds of staffers, are somehow to be, we should have less sympathy from them because there's a couple of outliers. Also, by the way, even relatively big names in journalism don't make a ton in the grand scheme of living. The grand scheme of things.
That.
That's not a direction I would take my career for financial benefit.
Well,
as someone who really wanted to be a journalist, it was not financially viable. And I talked to a lot of people in the industry, and it just was not.
The New York Times pays better than other.
Yeah, as a relative measure, and it's also earning a lot more than other people. And that again,
and it also has very high quality people, sure, but some people in the journalism industry are frankly replaceable because assembling listicles is not a life skill that can't be taught to others.
Right, but the New York Times isn't assembling listicles. That was more Ben Smith's beat over at BuzzFeed. Right. No disrespect. Yeah. So again, if the prevailing attitude is that the value that is created by all of these workers really isn't all that in a bag of chips, well, then the New York Times can deal with the fact that all of its employers are gone now. And I applaud them for taking this very difficult step to make, because they are at the top of the industry. They are in these peak positions that I think a lot of them have been working very hard to get to their entire lives, and they're willing to put it on the line as a matter of principle, and the solidarity that's being shown across the New York Times is really terrific. Apart from
that's your view, that's not my view, but
yeah, apart from my family member inadvertently sending me their Wordle score this morning, which I had to correct. I think the solidarity.
Oh, was there a call out there? Was there a call out?
Yeah, I had to be like, my friends, we're not supposed to be doing this today. Did you forget? But we will continue to follow the story and see what actually comes of this labor action. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.